right, we're going to start our next position here. And you're like, well, this is supposed to be an endgame video. We'll get there. And oftentimes, you need to understand certain positions before ever going into them. And here, after bishop takes d5, we're down a pawn with black, and we've got a situation with mass liquidation taking place. So before black ever allowed the capture on d5 by playing the bishop to a6, he had to be sure that he could hold this endgame. And it looks like, since we understand the 3 versus 4 is a draw, if we could trade off our B and A pawns for his B and A pawn, or B and C pawns rather, we can hold this because we have the ideal structure. Let's see what he does. We trade one set immediately. Check. Rook a1. Again, we see him bothering the base pawn. And we reach the rook and 3 versus rook and 4 that we know as drawn. So let's repeat the process that we saw in the previous video with technique. King g7, want to keep him out of key squares. Rook a3, base pawn. When you can't cut off the king, attack the base pawn, keep the king tethered to it. g4, white doesn't waste any time. And honestly, taking with a pawn may seem more natural, but it leaves the king too open. I imagine after rook a1, I'm just going to check and then go after your base pawns until you eventually have to do something like push h5. And then when I trade, it's going to be an easy draw. So king takes g4, leaves more winning chances. And important point here, h5. So this is the only moment that I find instructive in the entire game. This entire endgame. The rest of it is very, very natural rook and pawn technique. But it comes down to asking the question, what do you want with white? What do you want with black? And what do I want with black? I want to prevent white's ideas. White would love to push his majority in a way where it's going to be very, very annoying. So ideally, like get a pawn on f4, get the king here. Maybe at some point get a pawn on f6. If the king gets here, there's back rank problems. And it just doesn't look fun. So if I can prevent any of this from happening, I give myself a lot better chances to hold. So this is the star move, f6. And you normally don't want to push the pawns, but here it prevents you from getting in a bind and gives you extra squares to work with as your king's back isn't against the wall. Rook b5, and it should be noted that we're just going to kick them right back. No problems. So rook b5, rook g1. And why do we always play on? Here, it's very easy to lose the game with white. So why do you always have the perspective of looking to win no matter what? There's no playing for a draw. Because your opponent can very well slip up and have a really bad day. King f4, much stronger. Keeping the king out of f5. Now, big threat here. Always be asking, what's the idea? Stop it. If he goes king f5, we check him away again. Protect your base pawns like your life depends on it. Cutting off the king. You cut me off? Oh, okay. So I go tethering to the base pawn again. You can't approach because I'm going to take. Preventing the push. Checking distance. My king's close, so it forces you to waste time. Finally, f4. We grab a pawn. And as we talked about in the initial video of the series, this is going to fall under either Lucina or Fildor. Lucina is the winning version. Fildor is the drawing plan. And in this case, our king is touching the queening square of the pawn, and we're in good position. So this is a Fildor. After king g7, rook e6, check, we don't want to trade. Again, never trade your last rook. Why? When you can just do this. Okay, cutting off the king. Again, hopefully you're starting to see these themes over and over and you're like, oh, okay, this makes sense. Check. Base square. Base pawn. We're either cutting off the king or bothering the base pawns. King f7. Not letting the king approach easily. If the king steps up, we take the pawn with check. King f7. And finally, white's going to try to push. And we're going to get a key moment very soon here. Don't fall for this. King f7. Rook a6. And this is the Philidor idea. And we'll see a few more jockeying moves before the pawn is finally pushed. And this is the key of the Philidor idea. Once the pawn is pushed to this square with one file of separation of the king, now we put our rook as far away as possible because the king cannot step in front of the pawn anymore. So it is infinite checks, and with it we have a draw. So let's make sure we understand the Philidor plan. That once we get this position, there's nothing that white can do. So he can check us away, he can do different things. All right, let's say he brings the rook behind the pawn, I wait, you push. You have no way to make progress here, and I'm going to check you forever and ever and ever. That is the Philidor. And also, there's when the Philidor goes bad, I think we need to go to the short side here. Your rook needs to be behind the pawn. And as he is making progress, and let me turn on my friendly neighborhood engine because I definitely don't want to tell you wrong. Yes, I'm still holding. My technique's still good here. You can't go king yet, of course, because you just dropped the pawn. So let's go king e6 first. And now the idea of being behind the pawn is so when we go king g7, if he pushes, we can take. So he keeps trying to force us away, but we're staying on the short side, not the long side. That's important too. And if he ever pushes, we're back to infinite checks. And if he comes here again, I mean, we have multiple ways to hold it, but I think my preference is with just staying tethered to the pawn, because we can see if the king is here and our rook is behind, we control the f6 square, not our opponent. So those are the two different Philidor drawing techniques. I wanted to kind of highlight those on this. I think it's very important to understand the defensive mindset with holding these positions. So hopefully this has been instructive for you so far. If you're enjoying this in-game series, put a like on the video just to show your support. Completely free to do so. And if you haven't subscribed, I would love to have your support. So, and hit that bell notification if you really love it. Thanks.